Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today I'm happy to welcome back to this program journalist Ryan Grim. Ryan Grim is the DC bureau chief of the Intercept. He joins us for a conversation about his book called The Squad, AOC and the Hope of a Political Revolution. He's also host of the podcast called Deconstructed. Ryan Grim, it is a good pleasure, sir, to welcome you back to this program.
Always nice to be here. How you doing, Mitch?
I'm okay. I'm glad we're having this chat about the squad. The squad, when we say the squad, what we mean is somewhat this small group, progressive group in Congress, mostly made up of members who were elected in recent years, people like AOC, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib. And we'll talk more in a moment about the squad, its past, the notion of even what the squad is and where it comes from. But I want to begin with something that actually kind of surprised me when I first sat down with your book and preparing for our conversation. And I just wasn't expecting it. It made sense afterwards, makes sense now. But that was the outsized role that the Israeli lobby plays in this telling that you have of the squad. And it really begins at the very beginning of when we first, start hearing about AOC and Ilhan Omar.
I thought that when the book came out, people might be curious, like, wow, there's a lot of focus on AIPAC and its allied super PAC, Democratic Majority for Israel. Is it really true that they wield this much power, not just inside the Democratic Party, but particularly at the members of the squad and their allies in Congress? But after October 7th, I think it's become, extremely clear to everybody that no, this actually really is the central issue that they have been grappling with since running in 2018, even though none of them organized their campaigns around that question. Not even Rashida Tlaib. Tlaib obviously cares passionately about the issue. She comes from, her family comes from Palestine. But environmental justice was a key concern of hers, and broadly the kind of Bernie Sanders agenda. Like, that's what she really ran on. Certainly when it came to AOC, during the 2018 campaign, she even said, "I'm not a geopolitical expert on this." Famously in one interview, this was when I talked to Justice Democrats, they would say that they often would be asked, "Why do you guys focus so much on Israel, Palestine?" And they'd say, we don't. That's not even one of the kind of litmus test issues that we use when we're recruiting candidates. They don't want progressive other than Palestine candidates, but it's not a litmus test. It's just that the issue forces itself on the candidates and on the members of Congress. It's just unavoidable due to the amount of money that gets spent in campaigns and on lobbying around the issue.
What is Justice Democrats, and is it connected closely to the squad?
So Justice Democrats was founded out of the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign in March of 2016, when it was clear to some members of the staff that Bernie didn't have a path anymore to the nomination, but wasn't going to drop out until the convention. A group of them left and formed a new organization that they called Brand New Congress. And the goal of it was to elect 435 working class Bernie-style progressives in every seat across the country. They were going to run populists in Republican primaries and populists in Democratic primaries. It very quickly became clear that amid the extent of the hyperpolarization in our politics, you really couldn't have an organization that did both. And so they spun off one of them and called it Justice Democrats, which focused specifically on Democratic primaries, and left kind of Brand New Congress to continue to try to perform its original mission. But by a year into its founding, it was clear that they were not going to be able to pull off their mission. Their hope was they would spark a national wave of interest in this project, and that candidates would rise up around the country And that phenomenon would then drive media attention to all of these candidates, who would then benefit in terms of fundraising. Like, that was the theory of the case. Did not happen. And so by late 2017, early 2018, they're grappling with the question of what to do now. They had a handful of candidates. Some they had recruited, like Cori Bush, Ocasio-Cortez, and some others. Others they had endorsed, because they allied with their kind of positions, but they had not recruited them. Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. I mean, you can Ayanna Pressley. There's some debate over what it means to be to recruit somebody, or and on and on. But these are candidates. These are not people that went from bartending, or from the streets like Ocasio-Cortez and Bush straight into politics. Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley had all been elected officials before, state legislature and city council, Boston City Council, respectively. And so they're left with this kind of rump group, and they had to decide what to do. And they, at a retreat, they finally decide, okay, we're just going to put all of our eggs into one basket, and that we have the best shot at toppling the highest profile Democrat with the least amount of resources, because the least amount of turnout, is New York 14, which is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so they basically abandon all of their other candidates for the most part, and just put all of their resources into AOC. It actually ended up working for Pressley, because she benefited then from the momentum. Her race was like a month or two after AOC's, so she benefited from that like surge of energy. Like, oh, we can topple an incumbent member.
It was a moment. It was a moment
Yeah.
that took the whole country by
Right.
surprise, but also, as you said, had great energy behind it.
Yeah, exactly. And then, Tlaib wins her primary, Omar wins hers, and now you have this. Now the media does get interested, because now they've got a diverse portrait of telegenic women of color who are coming to Congress and shaking up the Democratic Party, and you can connect it to the energy from the Bernie Sanders campaign. And so that was a story that the media was interested in telling.
So sticking, and I do want to really dive into like the relationship, if that's even the right word, might not be the right word, but the dynamic with the Israeli lobby. You mentioned another group I want to ask you about, Democratic Majority for Israel, otherwise known as its acronym DMFI. Tell me more about what is DMFI.
Yeah, so AIPAC until 2022 had never launched a super PAC before. They saw that as crossing the line from their kind of grassroots advocacy, because say what you want about them, they are extraordinarily well organized. Regional political directors, deputy regional political directors. Each, different cities and towns have very active, popping organizations and chapters. Like, you cannot accuse them of being just a fake kind of big money AstroTurf group. And so they, just similar to the NRA, for instance, or the old Sierra Club, with really active kind of, grassroots forces. And those were powerful. And AIPAC didn't want to look like they were kind of a big money AstroTurf operation. So they resisted getting involved in the super PAC game for longer than most organizations with similar firepower. What they did countenance was in the 2020 cycle, launched in January 2019, just as the squad was being sworn into office, was the spinning out of this super PAC Democratic Majority for Israel, which, as I report in the book, if you're an AIPAC donor, you get certain credits, for donations you make. If you give, let's say you give this is not exactly how it works, but like, this is just an example. You give $100,000 at the annual convention, you might get to go to a private meeting with a bunch of rank and file Democrats or Republicans. You give $1 million, you might be in the dinner with Schumer. You give 10 million, you're going on a trip somewhere with Steny Hoyer or something. It's like
Is that how it
you
usually
just,
works?
and that's not unique to APAC.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's different tiers. It's the same thing that you see on like Kickstarter. Like you give $25, you get a CD. You give $50, you get a tote bag. It's just on steroids because they have a lot more to offer. And so in the 2020 cycle, you could count your donations to DMFI toward your APAC credits. In other words, so they were encouraging people like we're not. This is not our branded thing. This is not what we're doing. But if you want to support this, we support the idea of this happening. Also, APAC had been so tightly allied with Netanyahu, and Netanyahu had been clashing so hard with Obama that they needed a separate brand at that point anyway. Um, and in fact, the main clash was over the Iran deal. If you remember Obama's Iran deal, the lead APAC kind of advisor who organized the kind of anti-Iran deal operation was a fellow named Mark Mellman, who was also had Yair Lapid as his client. Yair Lapid became Israeli foreign minister. At one point, he served actually as Israeli prime minister, one of the few non-Netanyahu people to be prime minister since the 90s and 2000s. And he is the one that then spun off Democratic Majority for Israel. And he was very explicit that the kind of the rise of these progressive critics of Israel, particularly Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, were the reason that this organization needed to be funded. First opportunity they got to spend money in the field came against Bernie Sanders in his presidential campaign, where they went up with ads in Iowa, coming after Sanders, saying and setting a pattern that has mostly held to this day, although we can talk about some exceptions, where the ads and the spending have nothing to say about Israel, nothing to do with Israel. It's like it would say paid for by Democratic Majority for Israel, paid for by DMFI PAC. But the actual ad, for instance, when it came to Bernie Sanders, was Bernie Sanders just had a heart attack. He's not ready to stand up to Donald Trump. When they were running millions of dollars worth of ads against, say, Summer Lee or Donna Edwards in progressive, in primaries, they would say, well, Donna Edwards is bad at constituent service. Summer Lee has been too critical of Biden. Like, it would never be the case that they would say she's too critical of Israel or she's too supportive of Palestinian rights. One exception is that Cori Bush, before she even had a challenger this cycle, AIPAC put out an ad criticizing her for being pro-Hamas. So that was the first time, allegedly pro-Hamas. And that was the first time that I saw that the question of Israel-Palestine was actually mentioned in the ads. Because in a Democratic primary, you have a lot of people who obviously are, support Israeli civilians and support democracy and police and on, but they're not hostile in Democratic voters are not hostile in Democratic primaries to Palestinian rights. So you're going to lose that argument if you have it on the merits, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out this time around.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions about how what's happening in Gaza right now can affect this upcoming election.
Oh yes, and I wonder how the support for Israel was highest, on October 7th, and Israel's response to the atrocities on that day have eroded its support consistently. So that's the high watermark, and so you're going to have, for instance, Jamal Bowman has a primary challenge in his district in Bronx and then north of the city, which is going to be redrawn, and when they do redistricting, that might determine who wins that race. But setting that aside, his opponent, George Latimer, is going to have to find a way to defend the indefensible, as the indefensible gets even more indefensible month after month. People say, well, American voters have a short memory, but there's no sign that this is ending anytime soon. The catastrophe that Israel produced over there is only getting worse by the day.
It also brings the question as to will people vote? Some will, some always will on any issue, but will enough people to make a significant difference vote over something that's happening on the other side of the world? But of course, this is unique because this is getting so much attention and is really, appalled many people of, what happened on October 7th and what has happened since in Gaza. So a lot of this will be interesting. Coming back to DMFI, so this is a super PAC that's created by AIPAC. Is that the correct way to say it? This was created by AIPAC?
So they would quibble with that, but it was supported by AIPAC.
Okay.
And it was allied with AIPAC.
And it's for Democrats.
And it was created by AIPAC people.
Yeah.
So yes. But it's not legally linked to AIPAC.
Right.
And yes, and it was specifically to spend money in Democratic primaries.
Wow. So this is the first time then that AIPAC gets into the super PAC game.
Right. And then in 2022, and so to bring it up to then, so Jamal Bowman, takes on Eliot Engel. And he's a Justice Democrat backed candidate. And Cori Bush takes on Lacey Clay in St. Louis. But Eliot Engel was the big one. Eliot Engel, one of the most outspoken defenders of Israel in the Democratic Party, and also the House Foreign Affairs Committee chairman.
Yeah.
So this is he's been more than 30 years in Congress. This is a big player in Congress. And Jamal Bowman gets millions spent against him by DMFI. And they really flubbed the issue. Like they transparently used money from Republican donors, which AIPAC does as well, but is able to route it through, enough different vehicles that by the time it gets there, it's hard to say, well, this is Republican money. That was a problem when it became public. Actually, Intercept reported it, and then it became a big issue in the Democratic primary because you've got these Democrats who don't like Republican money being spent in their primary. Then the ads themselves attacked Jamal Bowman, I think, for some like tax liens he had from years earlier, when he was a struggling working class guy. And certainly in the wake of the George Floyd killing and with the like explosion of the sympathy for the movement for Black Lives, to have these ads attacking Jamal Bowman for like an old since resolved tax lien where he owed like $1,500 or something, just was tone deaf, and counterproductive. And so Bowman won in a landslide. Bowman won Jewish precincts throughout most of the district. And after that, AIPAC decides, okay, like we need to do this ourselves. And so in 2022, they launched their own super PAC. I think it was called the United Democracies Project, and spent more than $30 million in 2022, like blowing away what DMFI had spent.
And they're targeting Jamal Bowman?
They are targeting Jamal Bowman. In 2022, they targeted him again. He survived, and they spent heavily in races across the country where there were candidates who were either critics of Israel or they described themselves as kind of aligned with the squad. And so even if they weren't critical of Israel, AIPAC would assume that they probably then also were supportive of Palestinian rights.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with veteran journalist Ryan Grim. Ryan Grim is the D.C. bureau chief of The Intercept, and he joins us for a conversation about his book, The Squad, AOC, and the Hope of a Political Revolution. So let's go sort of to the early years then of the Squad and the alarm that the Israeli lobby has towards people like AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. You said earlier, Ryan Grimm, that none of these members really campaigned on the issue, not even Rashida Tlaib, who's Palestinian American herself. So what was it that spurred AIPAC into action to start opposing these newly elected members? And was it even before they were elected?
It basically was, yeah. And it was clear Omar and Tlaib are both Muslim. I believe both had supported BDS, or at least one of them had. I think both had. So like it was understood that they were willing to be critical of Israel, even if they were not leading their campaigns with that. And very early on, Kevin McCarthy, before they had really said anything at all, um, as House Minority Leader, the Republican Minority Leader, he said he was going to move to like censure them or discipline Tlaib and Omar. And then Omar um, responded by saying, like, of course he is. Like, this is all about the Benjamins. And somebody said, well, what Benjamins are you talking about? She's like, APAC. And that really, that ended up consuming months of 2019.
She was accused of being anti-Semitic.
Being anti-Semitic, playing into a trope that money and Jewish manipulation and on and on. And she later said, like, she apologized, and I think authentically so, because a lot of people close to her were like, you don't understand. A lot of Jewish people close to her were like, you don't understand how close that cuts. And you've got to think about the way that it's received, even if that's not how you meant it. And I think because so many of her allies came to her about that, she's like, okay, I get it. She still would say, and then she got in trouble later for this. She's like, I don't understand why I can talk about how money from the pharmaceutical industry influences our pharmaceutical policy, how money from the NRA influences our gun policy, but I can't say that money from APAC pushes us to have allegiance to a foreign country over ours. And then she got censure calls again because she's like, well, that's another trope, which is the kind of trope of dual loyalty. And I think in general, she wasn't aware of a lot of these tropes, like that. The dual loyalty. She is now. Like I think she's because
a lot of people aren't
stumbled. Right. If you're not kind of you're not born knowing that stuff. Like somebody has to teach you that at some point. And from her perspective, she's just making a logical point. And a lot, and AOC got in trouble too, using logic and universality on an issue where that gets you in trouble. That's what's so weird about kind of the question of Israel Palestine. Like she had said in a 2018 interview and a 2018 statement that it was appalling that the IDF was shooting and killing unarmed protesters in Gaza. And she was asked about that later in an interview, and she's like, I'm just talking about it through the lens of as an activist, that if they were killing 60 unarmed protesters in Puerto Rico or 60 unarmed protesters in Ferguson, I would be appalled by that as well and say that it needs to stop. And the interviewer, Margaret Hoover from Firing Line, said to her in response to that, right, but the situation and the geopolitics of Israel-Palestine are different, aren't they? And she's like, well, yeah, sure, they are different, but what do you mean? Like, it's like, yeah, they're different, but the question of whether or not you can mow down unarmed protesters shouldn't really be influenced by the fact that there are geopolitics involved. Like, that should just be a general universalist claim that we are able to make. And I think finding out in real time that making universalist claims is itself offensive to some people about, if you're claiming that Palestinian struggle is similar to other struggles, like people find that offensive. Like I write in the book, there was a Pittsburgh, he was a founder of like the major, he was like, or I think publisher of like the major a major Jewish paper in Pittsburgh, who was pushing for the defeat of Summer Lee in a primary challenge. He said what bothered him most is that he saw a tweet where she compared the kind of plight of Palestinians in Gaza to African Americans under Jim Crow in the United States. And he's like, that rhetoric is extremely dangerous. And he didn't unpack or explain, why that was. It was just kind of taken as a given in that article in his interview, like that's a dangerous assertion to make. Like, how dare you say that these struggles are remotely parallel. And I think so for people who were not kind of schooled in this issue, and Summer Lee would say, like growing up in her neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, it wasn't something that they talked about. The state house in Pennsylvania was they weren't talking about Israel Palestine. AOC would say at my table, my Puerto Rican dinner table in the Bronx, like it's just not an issue we talked about a lot. And so to then just talk about it like you would talk about any other issue, but be told that what you're saying is offensive, I think it was a shock to a lot of them, and has put them on their heels in a significant way.
In that 2000 interview that you were talking about with AOC, and she was talking about being appalled by the mowing down of unarmed protesters. This is part of what was known as the Great March of Return in Gaza.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's right. Which people have kind of relearned about during this war. This was this 2018 civil society driven protest. Hamas was not supportive of it for a long time in the beginning. Hamas is not generally supportive of most kind of civil protest. Hamas wanted armed conflict. But civil society within Gaza organized these marches every Friday. They would meet in a particular area, kind of near a fence. They'd picnic and have be a kind of jovial family kind of atmosphere, and then nonviolently, peacefully march to the fence, symbolically demonstrating their right to return to the land that they could see on the other side of the fence. That their parents or grandparents or they themselves had once lived on. And it didn't take long for the IDF to start opening fire. That was one of the one of the deadlier days is the one that AOC spoke out about. But every Friday they were getting blasted. The United Nations later counted, I forget the number of limbs that the IDF blew off, but it later emerged that there was an explicit strategy of kind of trying to shoot people's legs off. There's one sniper who gave this infamous interview where I think he shot 42 knees in one day or something. And AP wrote about how in Gaza, something more than like 10,000 people had lost limbs, and which in a city of just over 2 million people means that everywhere you look, you would see the deadly or near deadly consequences of the response to the March of Return, Great March of Return. Right. So that was the context within which she was defending the right to protest.
And again, this is on Firing Line. It's a BBC show, right? Firing Line.
I think it's PBS.
Oh, is it PBS? Is it now? Oh, it is PBS.
You might be.
I don't know.
You might be right.
I
don't know.
No, I'm thinking of Hard Talk on BBC.
Oh, okay.
I was on vacation I'm still getting my stuff together here, Ryan. You're right. It is PBS.
One of those state sponsors.
Yeah, that's right. State-sponsored media. And so AOC says that she is appalled by what you just laid out. And then the interviewer, if I recall correctly, then starts grilling down on her on more specifics about, history and policy in the region.
The first question was such a hard one. She's like, she says, "What's your position on Israel-Palestine?" Try to imagine getting asked that. First of all, imagine you were a bartender 4 months earlier, and you were on leave, or 3 months. You're on leave from your bartending job. And then you win the primary, and now you're getting asked the most open-ended question from somebody who's like on the other side of the political spectrum, so it's going to be hostile.
I do just want to quickly clarify, because you said earlier that all these members of the squad did have an elected position before.
Not Bush, but yes. Presley did, Omar did, Tlaib did.
But not AOC.
Not AOC,
okay.
Not Bowman, not Bush. Bush actually ran a long shot 2016 Senate campaign that nobody knows about because she got like 0.5% or something.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
But so for AOC, she had never held office before. She was not a policy wonk and was not schooled in this, and the question is, what's your view on Israel Palestine? Not even like a question about anything in specific about it. Just like, I wouldn't even know where to begin to answer that question, other than say, I don't know, they should end the occupation, and then let her kind of drill down from there. But yeah, as you were saying, that interview became kind of a mess, but only because really she betrayed some insecurity around, and some lack of confidence,
because she didn't know a lot about the history and everything there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she at one point used the phrase "occupation of Palestine," and and Hoover jumps in. Well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by the occupation of Palestine? You can see her be like, "Uh-oh, I know there are third rails on this issue. Did I touch one or not?" Which is if you're going to touch a third rail, you want to know ahead of time that you're touching it, and you want to ram right into it, and just and proudly say, this is why I'm saying this. But if you touch a third rail and you're like, oh, I didn't even know there did. You don't even know if you did. Like, is this did I utter a word I'm not supposed to use in this context? And so finally she just taps out and says, look, I'm not an expert on this.
And this would all come to a head, at least on the House floor. There is, and tell me more about the dynamic around all of this, but Israel would actually have a war on Gaza in 2021. And for the first time, you get several members of the House taking to the floor one night, one after another, actually supporting, threatening support, financial support for Israel, or at least, putting strings on it. I'll let you clarify exactly what happened there. And then the squad was a part of this. And then in response to that, House leaders come up with, actually, we're going to double down in our support for Israel, and we're going to provide $1 billion for the Iron Dome. Tell me that story.
Yeah, so in May 2021, that was the second last Gaza war that we had. The last serious one before this one, there was a 3-day bombing campaign, I think, in 2022. But so Mark Pocan, who was the former co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, booked an hour on the House floor, which you can do as a member. And one after the other, Democrat after Democrat paraded to the House floor, denouncing the ongoing bombing of Gaza by Israel. And it wasn't just the squad. It was also, you had a number of people say, like Joaquin Castro, Andre Carson, Betty McCollum, Marie Newman, who was a Justice Democrat. And, those folks by themselves, or the squad kind of just by themselves, could be ignored, a little bit more easily. But the combination of them created this kind of like vision of a groundswell of opposition to what Israel was doing. And yes, Yair Lapid, who was the foreign minister at the time and Mark Mellman's client, calls Steny Hoyer and says, this is outrageous. That's about the Iron Dome. So right, the Congress, the Democrats respond by saying, eventually they respond by saying, we're going to show our support. We're going to show that our support is so strong for the Iron Dome for Israel by putting $1 billion. It's a round number, way more than they remotely could spend on it. We're going to send that over to the.
It was a lot more than they had sent in years.
Yeah, it was like double.
Thing.
It was like double what they had spent in like 10 years. Yeah. It was just an absurd
on the Iron Dome itself, right?
Right,
I mean,
on the Iron Dome itself. Yeah. It was just an absurd messaging number, like $1 billion. And the Progressive Caucus and the squad get together and they strip it out of the spending package that's moving forward. And then Yair Lapid calls Steny Hoyer and he's like, "What on earth happened?"
So they successfully stripped it out.
They successfully stripped it out because they said we'll vote down the spending package if this is in there. And Pelosi had to move the package through, so she pulled it out. And Hoyer had told Yair Lapid, "We'll give it an up or down vote, very soon." Basically apologizing, for what had happened. And then so they put the Iron Dome vote on the floor and kind of forced the question. Um, and I think they wound up with 9 no votes. AOC had initially voted no, but then, as I write in the book, she goes back into the cloakroom and realizes or decides that, like, if she votes no, that she's going to be persona non grata with the Jewish community in her district, and that will make it impossible for her to be a broker of peace.
There's a significant Jewish community in her district.
It's not tiny, but the size of it isn't the point, I think. And as her like they're, even if it's only a couple synagogues, she wants to be somebody who's able to bring people together, and that's one of the things that's difficult for her in her role, because she is, on the one hand, the kind of brought into Congress came into Congress as a burn it down radical, but she also wants to be somebody who can bring people together to get to a better world. And it's very, very difficult to play both of those roles. Usually those are different people that play those two roles, to be both Martin and Malcolm.
Yeah, I mean, she has come under some criticism from some parts of the left for, working with the establishment.
Right, and then right. Mm-hmm.
And so Steny Hoyer then says, "Okay, I'm going to have an up and down vote on just this issue." The squad and others were successful in stripping out that funding for Israel and the Iron Dome, and then Steny Hoyer, the number 2 in charge at the time for the Democrats, then says, "Okay, we're going to have a vote just on that by itself," and this was very upsetting to the folks who were able to strip that language from the original spending bill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much was. Yeah, because it was a sign that it was not business as usual anymore in Congress, and that contributed to the amount of money that was then spent in 2022 in those primaries, to make sure that this, not only did the squad not grow, but it actually shrank. They were able to take out Andy Levin, for instance, who would have been a critic of Israel and had been a synagogue president, so it was impossible to label his criticism as anti-Semitic. They took out Marie Newman in Illinois, who represented one of the largest Palestinian American communities in the country, in Illinois. And they took that Palestinian community and redistricted it. The Illinois Democrats did, they split it into like 5 different districts. Which they can do because Palestinians are not listed in the census as a minority. They're listed as white. Whereas if they were classified as a minority, I think they would have had a voting rights claim that they could have brought. But because they weren't, they were split into 5 different districts.
Purposefully?
Yes.
That was gerrymandered?
So that yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. It didn't get much coverage, or any, I think, maybe until my book.
Yeah. So this is when, and I think many of us will recall when this happened, AOC didn't completely reverse her vote on the issue, but changed it to, she didn't vote for the Iron Dome, but she just voted present.
Right.
And that angered a lot of Palestinian supporters.
Yeah, and I have this anecdote in the book where she's in the cloakroom and she tells Omar and Tlaib, "I think I'm going to have to change my vote." And Omar tells her, "Do whatever you have to do. I understand. Just don't go out there and cry." And Rashida tells Ilhan Omar, like, "Ilhan, stop telling people not to cry," because Rashida gets emotional often on the House floor. But then, of course, she goes out and it does overwhelm her, and she switches to president, which she then later explains is her effort to enable her to continue building bridges across different communities so that they can get to a place, a better place. But yes, it angered, and she acknowledged that it angered a huge number of people as well. But the Iron Dome vote is a particularly tricky one, especially the symbolic one, because the Iron Dome is literally built to defend against missiles coming into civilian
Right.
populations. So, in order to vote against that, and you have to explain to people who are not steeped in the issue, like why you would be against something like that, because to a normal person, it just sounds like it's just a protect. You're against protecting civilians. Like how terrible is that? Rather than seeing it as part of um, a military solution to a problem that doesn't have a military solution, and pushing a peaceful resolution to the conflict further away, and thus actually then putting people at more risk and in more danger. Because you have plenty of people who would say that the the path of Israel going down the Iron Dome enabled the country to then push aside efforts at peace and reconciliation, because they were living in this fantasy world that they could use technology to completely manage the conflict, which October 7th showed is a fantasy.
You know, I think this story is important, and important in a way that, in my experience, we, and this happened back in 2014. You're talking about the Iron Dome. Not the last time, but in 2014, when Israel was bombarding Gaza, we did constant coverage of it, and I came across the fact, and it was a lot of people don't feel like realized at the time, Barbara Lee, our own congressional member, known as a peace a lawmaker for peace, who opposed the war on terror, to great fame, had always supported aid to Israel, and for the first time, we've always been able to get somebody like Barbara Lee and other lawmakers to come on to talk to us about almost any issue except this. They just would refuse to come on. My radio station's known to be more Palestinian, have more of a pro-Palestinian perspective. But I always try to be fair and respectful. And they just wouldn't come on. And I did finally in 2014 get a written statement saying just what you said. I don't support the bombing of Gaza, but I only support the Iron Dome because that's defending people from missiles that are coming in. And so then October 7th happened, and then the bomb, and then what we've seen happen in Gaza since October 7th happened. And once again, and not just Barbara Lee, I don't want to only single her out. Ro Khanna is somebody who would routinely come on, talk about anything we wanted to talk about. We haven't been able to get a single Bay Area Democratic lawmaker to come on to talk about Gaza. And it's not because we haven't been trying.
Right.
And
it's fascinating.
Yeah. But I also see when we talk about, and there's other members we could talk about too, like former Democrat Donna Edwards of Maryland. What happened to Nina Turner when she tried to run for office? I mean, there are consequences for doing what like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and again now AOC have done.
And Donna Edwards is a wild story because she beat an incumbent Democrat in 2008, as I'm sure you remember, and he was so corrupt, he just quit so he could become a lobbyist faster, rather than finish out his term. Like lost his primary, boom, quits immediately, and he's still a lobbyist in D.C. That created a special election then, and she ran, I think, probably unopposed in the special election because she'd already beaten the incumbent Democrat, which meant that she ended up serving like the rump 6-month tail end of this guy's last year. After Obama was elected, Israel invaded Gaza. Right after the election, world's not watching. Was it Operation Cast Lead or Cast Lead?
Yeah.
It went on for months, and finally, as the reporting has since shown, the U.S. got Israel to stop because they didn't want it didn't want Obama's inauguration overshadowed by this war. Like guys, stop. This is you're killing us here. And so during that war, of that several month war, Don Edwards was a member of Congress. She spoke out against it and cast a vote like against that war. And from that moment, AIPAC did everything it could to get her out of Congress. And when she came back, tried to run again for Congress in 2022, they spent, I think, $7 million taking a race where she was up by like 50 points or something, similar to Nina Turner in Cleveland, and managed to beat her. And like I said earlier, didn't say we're coming after her because in 2008 she opposed the Israeli war in Gaza. Like that wasn't the message. The message was, when she was a member of Congress, she was basically like a lazy constituent service provider. Just something that they thought would stick. And they beat her. Yeah. And then the same, Nina Turner. With Nina Turner, she spoke out against the war in Gaza in 2021. I think she retweeted "If Not Now," which to AIPAC is, that's a felony to be remotely associated with "If Not Now," the Jewish anti-war group. That has become really popular among young people. And so, but she hadn't been outspoken on the issue. It wasn't like a major thing for her. But she was affiliated with the Squad. And that was enough for them to spend millions to take what would have been her seat. She was up by 30 to 50 points in polling, and then ends up losing.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to make this about me, but part of me is appalled that these lawmakers won't come on. And I'm probably burning these bridges because I've been talking about it since. So it's over for me.
Well, it sounds like the bridges weren't there to begin with.
Well, they were before this issue.
I mean, they were before, right.
But, before this issue, they were. And part of me is appalled because, my thought is, well, you are a civil servant. I know it's a tough thing, but this is what you need to come talk to your constituents about these issues that they very much care about. And believe me, my audience cares a lot about this very issue. And yeah, it'll be tough, but that's part of the job. But then the other part, if I put my I'm not a political scientist, but I pretend to be sometimes. If I were to put that hat on, I'm like, yeah, but what gain is it? What gain is there for them to do it?
Right.
It's only going to hurt them to do this.
Right. That's the problem, that there isn't a counterweight. I have an anecdote in the book where after the AOC had flubbed this interview in 2018, a week later, somebody from AIPAC reaches out and says, we'll help make sure that doesn't happen again. We can educate you, get you up to speed on this issue. And we got $100,000 raised, to start the conversation, more where that came from. And they were able to say no to that because they had political celebrity by this point. Every tweet was bringing in 5 figures. So they didn't need, this 6 figures. But they could also see how difficult it would be for a rank and file member of Congress to say no to that. A, because they need the money. And B, it comes with an implicit threat that they have that money ready to go. It's going to be spent one way or the other. It's going to be spent for you, or it's going to be spent against you. Whereas there's no kind of pro-Palestinian organization that you can go to that has an equal amount of either grassroots firepower or financial firepower. So you just are asking people to take a stance on an issue that will hurt them politically because it's the right thing to do. Some will do that, but it shouldn't be a surprise that you wind up with lopsided votes like 425 to 9. If you're relying on politicians to do the right thing just because it's the right thing.
Ryan Grim has been our guest. Again, Ryan Grim is the bureau chief for the DC bureau chief for the Intercept, and he has joined us for a conversation about his book, The Squad, AOC and the Hope of a Political Revolution. Ryan Grim, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mitch.